Welcome to Kate Jonker.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much to everybody for joining me here. It's lovely to have you here from all parts of the world. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us. And not all of you might be a diver, or you might not be an underwater photographer, so I'm not going to be sharing settings and boring things like that with you. I'm going to share with you tips and tricks and things that I've learned as an underwater photographer, and share some of my stories about my underwater photography journey, and hopefully you'll learn something from that. And if you're thinking about learning underwater photography, please stay to the end. I'm going to tell you exactly what you need to do to start out in underwater photography. Okay, let me just move to the next slide. So I'm Kate Jonker. I'm based just outside Cape Town in South Africa. I'm a data color friend with vision, an underwater photographer, an underwater photography coach, and I love writing articles. I write a lot of articles for magazines such as X-Ray Dive magazine, and I'm a regular contributor for Easy Dive magazine. And I also take part in a lot of underwater photography contests as a judge. I'm absolutely passionate about doing that. And on top of that, I'm a senior ambassador for Marilux. Marilux is a company that makes underwater photography equipment, housings, strobes, and things like that, everything that you need to take photos underwater. And I'm also co-owner of Indigo Scuba in Gordons Bay, which is a beautiful little seaside town outside Cape Town in South Africa. That's the dive business my husband and I own there. And also I'm the owner of Underwater Photo Company, which is a company that sells underwater photography equipment and trains people with underwater photography courses, one-on-one coaching, and underwater photography workshops to some of the most amazing destinations in the world. So what I want to talk to you about today is about the art, the magic, the challenges of capturing stories in one of the most unpredictable and beautiful environments on Earth, underwater. So shots like this might look effortless, but they really happen by accident. So I'd like to tell you a little bit of a story. When I started learning how to be a scuba diver, I was doing my open water course, and in the dive center there was a magazine, and in the magazine was an article about these creatures called dugongs. And dugongs were these, they almost were like underwater cows or teddy bears, and you'd swim around and you'd dive with them, and they'd come up to you and they'd hug you, and they just hugged divers. And I just thought this was so exciting, how to go underwater and see these amazing creatures and be hugged by them. And ever since I read that article, I wanted to go and find the dugong. And unfortunately, I discovered that it was actually quite difficult to find them. I did find out that you could find them in the Red Sea. And for 15 years, year on year, I went to the Red Sea to look for the dugong. And eventually I found a dive center that said they could show me the dugong. So 15 years on, I found myself standing on the beach, feeling really excited and nervous. Were we going to find the dugong? And just before we got onto the little rubber duck, the Zodiac boat that was going to take us out to look for the dugong, the dive boat skipper said to me, "It's here." And I was so excited. I could not believe my luck that there was going to be a dugong. I was finally going to see one, and my heart was pounding like crazy. And we jumped onto the boat, and I said to him, "How do you know that there's a dugong here?" And he said, "You see all of those people over there, they're swimming and they're chasing the dugong." And I thought, oh no, you know, they're going to chase it away. But eventually we got alongside the people that were swimming above the dugong that was actually down on the bottom grazing on the seagrass. And the dive guide said to me, "Let's just wait for it to come up. Let it come up for air and let it go down again. And once it settles down on the grass, we can go down and we can go and watch him." And I was sitting on the boat and I looked down and I saw this white shape come closer and closer to me on the boat. And there was the dugong, and my heart just skipped a beat. I was amazed. Here was this dugong that I'd been looking for 15 years right next to me. And I must say, I was so excited, and I did shed a few tears, because eventually after 15 years, the dugong appeared. And it went down to the bottom, it started munching on the grass. We went down and spent 45 minutes with this amazing creature, just taking photos and observing and admiring this creature that I've been looking for so many years. So not everything is guaranteed in underwater photography, and shots that you see might look effortless, but they really happen by accident. So welcome to my world of underwater photography. Underwater photography is beautiful, but it's also one of the most challenging but rewarding forms of photography. And one of the biggest challenges we have is that light underwater behaves very differently to light on land. And as we go deeper, we lose color. The light waves get absorbed by the water, and the deeper we go, the less light we have, and that means we lose color. So first of all, we lose the reds, then the yellows, and then the greens, and then the blues, until all we're left with at the bottom are blue. So blue and violet. So everything is left, all the colors have disappeared, everything is just blue. So we need to use strobes and artificial light to bring back the color. We also have limited time underwater. Due to the nature of being down at depth, we can only dive for a certain amount of time. So depending on how deep we are, if we're deep, then we can't stay for that long. And also we're restricted by the amount of air in our cylinders. So there's a lot of things against us as underwater photographers. We have a much less time to take photos as land photographers have. On land, you can wait for the sunrise, you can wait for the sunset. We don't have that luxury of being able to wait. So the time that we have underwater, we really need to make the most of. And then, of course, everything is in constant motion. We are moving, the marine life is moving, and we have to use settings and lighting to help freeze that motion and capture what we see underwater as perfectly as possible. And of course, nothing is guaranteed. You don't know what you're going to see from one dive to the next. You might want to go diving and look for dolphins, but there's no guarantee that the dolphins are going to be there when you get there. They're swimming around in the ocean, and if you see them, you're lucky. And also underwater photography is very equipment intense. We don't just need a tripod and a camera and batteries and lenses. We need lots of other things as well. And it can make underwater photography quite costly. So before you get put off about starting underwater photography, if you haven't started already, you really just need a camera, a housing, and I highly recommend just one strobe. Now a strobe is like a flash, but you can take it underwater and it brings back the light. It brings back all the light and the colors of your subjects. So it's really important, if you want to really take good pictures, is to have at least one strobe. And cameras also struggle to focus underwater because the cameras need contrast. So in order for our camera to see contrast, we need to add some extra light. So a focus light always helps your camera to see the contrast and to focus much more quickly. And then to put all that together, you need handles and trays and arms and clamps. So like in this picture here, I've got my TG7 housing, my Marilux housing, with one strobe. That's the thing with the white round sort of bulb thing there. That's my strobe. And then on the left-hand side, that's my focus light. And that's really all that you need to start out in underwater photography. You can then start adding wet wide-angle lenses, which help you get closer to your subject, especially on things like reefs, get closer to them and fill the frame with your reef and get closer and light it more easily. And then diopters, which is like a magnifying glass, which helps you get closer and magnify tiny critters under the water. So that's your basic setup. But if you really start out, all you need is a camera, a housing to keep your camera dry, and a strobe, and probably a focus light as well. So sorry, carry on.
Yeah, Kate, before you continue, currently there are no questions, but I will put here my first poll and we'll start here my first poll asking what kind of audience we have right now, and then you can continue. Is that okay?
Of course.
Okay, good. Okay, I simply want to know if we have photographers, videographers, or content creators here, or others, and then okay. Oh, it looks like, I don't know if you can see that. I will show that quickly. So we have 84% for, it's still growing. Okay, that means I can, okay, good. We have 80, now it should be shown. Oh no, sorry. We have Kurzumfrage verwalten, übertragen. Are you, now, okay, good. Now you see that. The technology sometimes is, okay, good. You see, yeah, most of the audiences are photographers, a few videographers, content creators, others interesting. Maybe simply curious people who want to learn something. Okay, good.
Yeah, I'd love to know how many of those people are underwater photographers.
This is the next question. This is then the next question. Yeah. So should we run that right as well? Then we've got it. And maybe we do that. We'll just start the second poll. Have you already practiced underwater photography? That is very simple question, at least. Yes, no, I would like to give it a try, you know. Oh, interesting. Wow. You see that, Kate, am I right? You see
I can't.
You can't? That is interesting, because I'm really surprised how many. Now, okay. Schließen. Übertragen. You see, wow. Yeah. Interesting, or so many. Wow, that's great. Okay, good. Now you've got a better picture, Kate, from your audience, and now I guess let's continue. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks for entering your answers to that poll. It's really helpful to know who I'm speaking to. So once we start off underwater photography, there is this thing where you're always wanting to get something new, whether it's a new camera, new housing, a snoot for your underwater photography. So there's always, you never stop buying equipment, unfortunately, because, you know, we always need to get the next best thing. So as an advanced underwater photography, which is where I am now, you tend to upgrade to a mirrorless or a DSLR camera. And then you need to get a housing for that camera too. And those can be made from a single block of aluminium that's carved away to make a housing for your camera, or polycarbonate housing. And for every lens that you use, you need to have a different port, which is what goes on the front of the housing, and it kind of closes the housing where your lens is. If you look at the photo here with me, that black bit on the front of the blue housing, that's your port. So depending on the lens that you have to have different ports. And for macro underwater photography, there are a lot of different lenses, but it depends on which camera you have. So for macro photography, there's a choice of a 35mm macro lens, 60mm, 90mm, 100 or 105, depending on the camera that you have. So most people normally have either a 90, 100 or 105, but those who want sort of a wider field of view might opt for a 30 or a 35mm macro lens as well. And those lenses then need different ports. And for wide angle underwater photography, you need to have a dome port. And what that does is it corrects how your lens sees underwater. And for the different types of lenses, you might need a different dome port as well. Underwater, we tend to use both rectilinear and fisheye lenses. And fisheye lenses tend to be that's my choice, because it enables you to get so much closer to your subject and really fill the frame with it. Because in underwater photography, what we want to do is we want to get as close to our subject as possible to reduce the amount of water between our camera and our subject, because the water acts as kind of a diffuser. and it makes our photos less sharp. So by getting closer to our subject, by using a fisheye lens or rectilinear lens, we're able to reduce that amount of water and create sharper pictures. And then again, we need trays and arms and clamps to put it all together. And once you've got all those things and you want to start specializing in maybe macro underwater photography or creative lighting in your underwater photography, we start adding things like snoots and diopters, those magnifying glasses that just help enlarge your subject when you're taking photos of it. So it is equipment rich. There's a lot of different things that you can do with underwater photography and lots of different lenses that you can use. So I use the Canon R5 and the R7, that's crop sensor. That's the R7 is a crop sensor and the R5 is a full frame. I use a 35mm macro, and with my R7, my 60mm macro lens and 100mm macro lens with both cameras. And both cameras, I also use the 8-15 circular fisheye. And I'm a Miralax ambassador, so I use their housing, their strobes, their snoot, and their diopters. But what could go wrong underwater? Lots of things, unfortunately, because we're taking our cameras in housing underwater. We have to really make sure that when we seal it properly, when we seal it properly, and that there's no hair or sand or dust on the O-rings that keep that housing nice and closed. So we always have to be careful that we don't get water into the housing, because that's going to flood the camera. So what happens if that does ever happen to you when you're diving and your housing floods? Always turn the housing with the port downwards, so that if any water gets into the housing, it goes down into the port, and then ascend slowly and carefully. Don't rush to the surface, go up to the surface, hand your housing to someone on the boat, but tell them to hold the port down so the water doesn't go into the camera, and then climb back on the boat and try to just hold the housing so that the water doesn't go onto your camera. So that's one of the things that we always fear, is flooded housings, and that's how you can try to save your camera if that happens. With compact cameras, we sometimes get the glass on the front of our cameras fogged up when there's a lot of moist air inside the camera, inside the housing, and it cools and condenses on the glass on the front of the port. That can prevent us from being able to take pictures. But if that happens to you, just put your thumbs over that glass. The heat from your thumbs will dissolve, it will evaporate that water vapor or the condensation on the inside of your housing, and it should eventually clear up that fog and make it go away. And of course, there's always, when we go diving and we want to take macro photos, we've got the macro lens on, and a whale shark or a dolphin or a seal or a shark swims by, and we can't take a photo because we've got a macro lens on. And then with the advent of mirrorless cameras, we're often very limited to the number of photos we can take before the battery goes flat. So it's often, we often only are able to take about 300 photos before the battery goes flat, especially if you're using the electronic viewfinder on your camera, because that uses more battery than the screen. So that's also, batteries can hamper our photography underwater. And of course, we make mistakes. So if you don't do test shots before you go diving, but always take test shots. Take some photos before you pack your camera away for the dive. Make sure that your strobes are firing, that the zoom gear is zooming. Take some test shots, because then you will be able to prevent things like leaving the lens cap on, which people do. They get down to the bottom and they want to take photos and they suddenly realize that the lens cap is still on the lens. So that's that dive gone. You can't take photos with the lens cap on your lens, and then not finding the subject that you want to find. So with me and my dugong wanting to find one for 15 years, you don't always find the subject that you're looking for on a dive. And then of course, the weather conditions. Sometimes we just can't dive because the sea's too rough and we can't go out. So there are lots of things that can go wrong, but we always try to minimize all those silly things that can happen to us as underwater photographers. So as I was talking about underwater, we don't have light, we lose light. So the top photo here you'll see is I normally do a test shot for wide angle underwater photography before I turn on my strobes so that I can see that my water is coming out the right color. So the top photo is the same photo, same scene as the bottom one. But the top photo is where we have no lights. That's what happens when you don't use strobes. The bottom picture is my second test shot with the strobes on, just to check my strobe positioning. And you'll see on the left-hand side and the right-hand side that there's some white speckles. Now those speckles are called backscatter, and that's something that we live with and have to try to prevent in underwater photography. Because what we want to do with wide angle underwater photography especially is we want to balance the ambient light, the light from the sun, with the light of our strobes that light the subject. So we use our settings to get the blue of the water, and we use our strobes to light our subjects. So what happens is, to prevent that backscatter, if you look at the top picture here, this is after I've got my strobes positioned in the right way. What I do is I have my strobes at either 9 o'clock or 9 o'clock and 3 o'clock, or 10 o'clock and 2 o'clock on either side of my housing. And I always have the front of my strobes positioned behind my port. And that's the best way to prevent backscatter for wide angle underwater photography. Always have the front of your strobes either in line with your handles, even sometimes behind your handles, to prevent backscatter. And the further away you go from your subject, the further out your strobes need to be. And the closer you are to your subject, the closer your strobes need to be to your housing. And with macro underwater photography, we also get backscatter, especially when there's the water column behind our subject. So the little blue ring octopus here had water behind it. And when I took my first photo of him, my strobes weren't positioned properly. So what was happening is my strobes are lighting the sand and the particles between my subject and my housing, and those particles then bounce the light back at my camera, and that's what causes backscatter. So backscatter is really just your camera's lighting up the sediment or the particles in the water between your subject and your camera, and then they bounce back the light back at your camera, and that's what causes backscatter. So we need to make sure that we position our strobes properly to prevent those lights or those little bits of water, sediment in the water, reflecting the light back at our camera. So the little diagram at the bottom here is how you'd position one strobe above your housing if you were using one strobe for macro underwater photography. And the diver here is taking macro photo, and they've got their strobes positioned for macro underwater photography to try to prevent backscatter. All right, so I think with underwater photography, there's lots of reasons why we want to take photos underwater. It might be to show people what we've seen, it might be to tell a story, it might be to create an awareness of what we see underwater. But there's some techniques that I'd like to share with you on how best to tell stories with your underwater photos. So the first thing in macro underwater photography is you want to make your subject the star of the show. And in order to do that, you can do that through color, by using bokeh backgrounds to separate your subject from a busy background. So using apertures to create bokeh backgrounds, or using light to light your subject to make them the star of the show, only lighting your subject using a snoot or inward lighting, and making the rest of the picture or making the rest of the scene black, so that only your subject is lit and the messy background isn't. That makes the star of the show your subject. Also with compositions, there's lots of different rules of compositions, but the two that I like to use the most is when you've got taking a photo of something small, rather put it on the rule of thirds, like this little crab here. It's on the intersect of the rule of thirds at the bottom. So if you've got a small subject in the frame, try to put it on one of the intersects of the rule of thirds. But if you've got something that's really big in the frame, you can put it in the middle. So people will say to you, don't bullseye your subject. But if it's filling your frame, put it in the center. You definitely can bullseye your subject. And then, of course, another way to tell stories is to show a sense of place, where your subject is, where it lives, where it is, can be found on the reef. It's always nice to show where your subject can be found. It gives context to maybe like this cuttlefish here. It camouflages itself on the reef. So always try to show a sense of place in your underwater photography as well. It can be really, really useful telling a story. Also, show humor. So I was taking a photo of this little hot lip spider crab, and as I was taking his photo, he posed for the picture. And so I took the shot. I just thought it was quite humorous of how he was posing for the photo. So it's also, when you're taking photos, wait for the peak of the motion, peak of the moment, and watch your subject, watch what they're doing. And if it's doing something interesting, try to photograph it when it's actually doing that interesting thing. And also challenge perceptions. So I know we were talking earlier about sharks and sharks in False Bay, and people always ask us as underwater photographers or divers, the first thing they ask us is, what about the sharks? Aren't you frightened of the sharks? And I think most divers and most underwater photographers will tell you that actually we wish we could see sharks more often, because they are so awe-inspiring and they're so amazing. And I took this photo when I was in the Red Sea, and here's my buddy Esther, and all she had was a GoPro. And the shark was so inquisitive and so interested in her, and just took this photo to show you that, sharks are inquisitive, they're interested in us too. And, you don't need to be frightened of them. They're beautiful, they're inquisitive, but always remember that you are in their territory. It's like going to a game reserve. There's a lion, it's his territory. Treat the sharks exactly the same. Treat them with, be wary of them, be aware of them, watch them, but don't be frightened of them. Sharks are beautiful creatures, and we need to show more photos of sharks so that people realize that they're not these man-eating monsters that a lot of people who don't dive perceive them to be. And then, of course, show personality. I was taking a photo of this little octopus, and it was tiny. It was only about 5 centimeters in size, and it was very, very inquisitive, but it was hiding behind these hydroids. And as I got closer to her, she would duck behind the hydroids. So I'd wait a little bit, and she'd come and have a look at me. And then I got a little bit closer, and she'd duck again. So we were kind of playing this hide and seek game until I was close enough to take her photo. And I waited for her to look at me, and I captured her picture. And when I took the photo, I just felt this amazing connection with this little octopus. And I think what's also really important about underwater photography is, if you feel emotion, try to show it in your pictures. Because a lot of underwater photographers will say to me, I want to create an emotional response in my viewer. But the problem is, if you don't feel an emotional response, if you don't feel an emotional connection to your subject, when you're taking a picture, you can't expect anybody else to feel an emotional connection or have an emotional response to your photos. So always try to create that connection with your subject and show it in your pictures. Unfortunately, not everything is beautiful underwater, and I think as underwater photographers, we also need to show people the other side, the ugly side, what we see underwater, because it creates an awareness to people of what is happening, the overfishing, the pollution that goes on in the oceans. And if we can take photos that will shock people and make them realize that it's not just all beautiful, we can also create an awareness of how people what they can do to prevent this from happening underwater, to help prevent pollution and overfishing. And it's really important as underwater photographers that we use our photography to tell stories, not just about beautiful things, but also the other side of what's happening in our oceans. I'm very passionate about macro underwater photography, and what I love about macro underwater photography is it brings those tiny critters to life, and they have such characters, and they are so beautiful, and they're so detailed, and I just love macro underwater photography because it's challenging as well. It's much more challenging than wide angle underwater photography, according to me. I'm sure there'll be people out there that disagree, but macro underwater photography is much more challenging, but it also gives you the ability to be more creative with your photography. So we're taking photos of things that are tiny. For example, the amphipod in the middle photo, it's only 2 millimeters in size, and it's actually sitting on the top of a cuttlefish egg. And I used my TG6 to take this picture with a snoot. And that's, you know, just shows you that photos can be really, underwater photography photos can be very misleading, especially macro photos, because often we see things that are really big, but they're actually in real life, they're very, very tiny. So for example, the little hermit crab on the left-hand side, he was probably about 3 millimeters in diameter. And I just spotted this little hole with these little eyes poking out at me. When I took the photo and looked through my viewfinder, I actually saw it was a little crab. So macro underwater photography is challenging, but it's a lot of fun because it reveals just the most amazing creatures that tend to get overlooked underwater. So one way of doing macro underwater photography is by separating our subject from the background by snooting. And with snooting, what you're doing is you're actually painting light on your subject. So for example, this photo I took in Lembe recently, I was using my snoot, and I'll show you just now what a snoot looks like. And he was swimming away from me, but he kept turning around and having a quick look and swimming away again. So I followed him very slowly. I had my snoot, the tiny beam of my snoot, hovering over him all the time. And when he turned around and looked at me, I took his photo, and this was the result. So with snooting, what you want to do is you want to actually take out all the ambient light from the sun. So you do not want any light other than the light of your strobe to show. So to do this, what we use is we use a small aperture, because a small aperture lets less light in. We use our fastest shutter speed that our strobes sync with our camera. This is another reason why I like my R7, because the maximum sync speed of my camera is 1/320, where with some cameras, for example, the Sony, it's 1/160, and most other cameras, it's 1/200 to 1/250, and the Nikon D850 also goes up to 1/320. So with the R7, it gives me the opportunity to use a faster shutter speed without having to get flash high speed sync triggers and things like that. So I like that too about my R7. And then also we use the lowest possible ISO, because that will also help us minimize the ambient light in our pictures. So if I was to turn off my strobe, turn off my snoot, this picture would be completely black.
Another question was, what about the strobe in this case? I guess it's referring to the technique you described
Yes.
on the chart before.
Yes. So what we do is we attach a snoot to a strobe. So I've used this picture here so that you can see which is the strobe and which is the snoot. The snoot is the black part and the strobe is the gray part. Now the strobe is what creates the light underwater. When you press your trigger, it triggers to take the photo, it triggers the strobe and the strobe fires. What happens with the snoot is you'll see on the right-hand side, there's a very narrow sort of pipe thing. And that's where the light that comes out of your strobe comes out. And it narrows and condenses the light so that only the beam is very narrow, and it creates a pool of light, and you can adjust the size of that pool of light to light up your subject. So the Marilight snoot that I use, it's got a knob on the side, and you can make the size of the beam bigger or smaller, which is really useful because other snoots have what's called a mask. And a mask is a little piece of card or plastic that goes into the side of the snoot, and you have to move it backwards and forwards to make the size of the holes or the holes bigger or smaller. And the smaller the hole, the smaller the beam of light. The bigger the hole, the bigger the beam of light. So if you want to change the size of the beam of light, you have to move that sort of mask in and out. And when you move the mask in and out. It moves this, it can often move the snoot. And the hardest part of using a snoot is actually positioning it to line up with the focus of your camera and line up with your subject. So you can spend almost 10 minutes getting that beam of light, that narrow beam of light in the right position to perfectly light your subject. So snooting is very challenging, but the results are very rewarding. It's a lot of fun to do if you're patient, but really snooted photos are can be absolutely beautiful because of the direction of the light. Directional lighting actually means that you can light your subject from the top or diagonally, and it just creates beautiful sharpness of your subject with snooting. So it's really a technique to really take them to use and to master. My favorite technique is shallow depth of field.
Sorry.
Yes, sorry.
Before you continue, Valeria has also 2 questions to this snooting. Do you believe,
yes.
I'm just reading both, do you believe that the Marlux, I don't know if I pronounce it right, snoot is the best, firstly? Secondly, does it has several diameters? Which is the diameter that you use the most in your snoot? I guess you answered that already, am I right? Or
yeah. Okay, I'll answer the first question. I've used a lot of snoots. I've used basically all the snoots on the market because I am so inquisitive when it comes to equipment, and I like to know all the equipment and how it works. So I have used a lot of snoots. I can say that the Marlux Soft Light or Soft Pro is really, really good to use for 2 reasons. The first reason is that it has its own inbuilt aiming light, which means that normally when you use a different type of snoot, you have to use the focus light of the strobe to go down the snoot to show you where your snoot is going to light when you press your trigger. With the Marlux snoots, it has its own inbuilt aiming light, and it's very bright. So it doesn't matter what strobe you use, you will always see where your snoot is going to light when you press the trigger. So that's the one reason that I really like it. The other reason I like it is that you don't have a fixed size hole. So you can turn that dial and you can have a hole that will create a beam of light that's a couple of millimeters in diameter. Or you can make it really wide and you can have a hole or a beam of light that's about 5 centimeters in diameter. Then of course it depends on how high up or how low down you put your strobe to your subject. So for me, the Marlux snoot is definitely my favorite. It's the easiest one for me to use.
Okay, good. Then Kate, would you recommend to use 2 5-inch arms when I'm snooting with my TG6 to give more movement and flexibility of positioning?
Yes, I think that's a great idea. Even though with the TG, you would have your snoot very close to the front of your camera, it actually makes it easier to have 2 strobe arms. I think an 8-inch strobe arms are too long. I would recommend 2 5-inch strobe arms for a snoot with the TG. That's what I use, and it works perfectly. Okay, yeah, for macro underwater photography, I absolutely love shallow depth of field, where you separate your subject from a busy background and busy foreground by using your aperture. So it depends on the camera that you have, and it depends on the lens that you have. So as I said, I like to use the 60mm macro, the 35mm macro, and the 100mm macro with my TG7, and my 100mm macro with my TG7, my R7, and my 100mm macro with my R5. So this photo I took with my R7. I was using a 100mm macro lens, and I had an open aperture of f5.6, my fastest shutter speed of 1/320, and my lowest ISO of ISO 100. So what I want to do there, because I've got such a wide aperture, it's letting a lot of light in. So to control that light, I use a very fast shutter speed and a very low ISO. So the low ISO and the fast shutter speed will control the ambient light. I use a strobe that's on a low power because I don't want to blow out my picture. My favorite aperture is normally f5.6 on my R7. On my R5, which is a full frame, I would use more like f8 and f11 because the cameras are built completely differently. So those are the settings that I would use more often than not when I'm using shallow depth of field to create bokeh backgrounds. And then with bokeh backgrounds, it also depends on how far or how close your subject is from the background. So if your background is close, you have to use quite an open aperture to make sure that it's quite blurry, because if your subject is quite close to the background, you have a better depth of field, so you need to make sure you use an open aperture, which reduces the depth of field. But if your subject is further from the background, it just makes the background blurrier. It's much easier to do shallow depth of field photos when your background is about 15 centimeters or more away from your subject. Okay, so macro underwater photography is really creative. There's so many different things you can do with macro underwater photography. You can do backlighting, you can use creative filters, and then you can use your snoot and you can create blingy backgrounds with reflective material behind your subject that you like with your torch or another strobe. You could do close, slow motion, blur, high key, and you can even use vintage lenses. So there's a lot of things that you can do with macro underwater photography, but create the art that you love. I think we're always worried about what other people think of our work, but I think if you're creating art, you need to love it and you need to enjoy doing it. And don't worry what other people say about your pictures. Remember, you're actually creating photos for yourself and not for other people, unless obviously you want to create an awareness of something that you don't like seeing, like the fish in the net. But really, macro underwater photography is a great way to create art and do things that you love. It's really important that what you do, you love doing, otherwise it will show in your photos. So with wide-angle underwater photography, it's a great way to bring a sense of adventure and exploration to your portfolio and to show people what you see underwater. It makes wide-angle underwater photography is much more relatable to non-divers. If you show a nudibranch to a non-diver, they probably wonder what it is, they'll love it, but it takes a lot more explanation than a beautiful wide-angle underwater photo. So some tips for wide-angle underwater photography: always get close to your subject. Have an anchor. Have a main subject in your picture. Have that as your anchor and build your photo around it. So for example, this cuttlefish or this beautiful soft coral here, or the soft coral with upside down diver. Always have something that's an anchor for your picture and build your picture around that. Add layers. So when I talk about layers, I talk about background from a shadow of a reef, or the layers of the goldies swimming in the water, or even the water surface. Always look up. There might be a boat on the surface. You might even see Snell's window, which is this circular, almost circular. This is almost Snell's window, the photo with the upside down diver, that circle. Always look up, include layers, include the undersurface of the water. It just adds more texture and interest to the photo. So for example, the photo with the soft coral and the orange fish and the reef shadow in the background, you can see the water surface. It's adding lots of different layers. With the top photo with the cuttlefish, because I was so deep, there was no opportunity for me to include the surface of the water. But if I'd been able to add the surface of the water, it would have added more texture and more detail to the photo. And I think it would have made it a little bit more interesting than it is right now. So always look up and always add textures and layers, and always have a subject that is the anchor for your picture. So when you're photographing wrecks, we cannot light an entire wreck. So it's always nice if you can find a part of the wreck that is easily recognizable as a wreck. So for example, the gun on the Thistlegorm, the top right-hand photo. if you can light that, people will easily recognize that it is a wreck. And add a diver to show a sense of scale, show how big the wreck is. You can't light an entire wreck. So what you could do is you could think in black and white, like I did when I took the photo on the bottom right-hand corner. I took the photo almost into the sun. The sun was kind of at like 11 o'clock to where I'm pointing. And what that's done is the sun has lit the side of the wreck. It's got a lot of growth on it. It's lit part of it's lit sides of the growth, but it's also created shadows on the sides that it hasn't lit. So always think in black and white. If you can't light your subject, if you can't light your wreck, think in black and white and how you can position the sun to create textures, and always try to add divers to give you a sense of scale. And then, yeah, when you're taking photos of sharks and dolphins and turtles, always add a diver if you can, especially if it's a shark, and you can make it interesting. It'll show how big the shark is. It will show that people don't need to be scared of sharks. Sharks and people can be in the ocean at the same time. We just need to respect them and be wary of them. And try to show personality. Get that eye contact. Get your dolphins or your turtle or your shark looking into the camera. Try to show the personality of your subjects. And one thing, when you're taking photos of the underbellies of the sharks or the necks of the turtle or the underneaths of the dolphin, they're very white. So you need to make sure that your strobes are not too bright, because if they're too bright, they'll overexpose and blow out the whites of those certain parts of those animals. So always be wary of how bright your strobes are, how close your subject is to you. Try to get in front of your subject so that you can catch it swimming towards you rather than away from you. And then just wanted to go through my workflow of how I bring it all to life. So what I do is in the morning of the day before I go diving, I charge all my batteries for my camera, my strobes, my focus light. And then during the day, I decide whether I'm going to do macro or wide angle. And if I'm not sure, I might phone the dive center and ask them what the conditions are like, where they're going to be diving, and that will help me decide whether I want to do wide angle or macro. And then I will set up my camera the night before. I'll set it all up. I'll do test shots. I'll check that if I've got a lens that zooms, I'll check that the lens zooms in and out, that the zoom gear is connecting to the dial. I'll take some photos, make sure my strobes are firing, and then I will check and double check that I've turned off my strobes and turned off my camera, because the last thing I want to do is when I jump in the water, find that my batteries are flat. So what I do then is in the morning, I pack my camera into a padded cooler bag and I go diving. And after I've been diving, I'll come home and I'll fill a tub of water with fresh water, fill a tub with fresh water, and I'll take all my arms off and my clamps off, and I'll put my camera in the housing and all the arms and the strobes and the clamps and everything in a tub of fresh water for 30 minutes whilst I'm washing my dive gear. And then after that, I'll take it all out and I'll dry it. I'll take my camera out of the housing and I'll download my photos from my SD card into Lightroom, and I'll do a backup onto an external hard drive. And then I will, when I download my photos into Lightroom, I'll save them in a folder under the year and the date and the dive site, so I know when those photos were taken and where they were taken. And then I'll go through those photos and I'll rate them. So I'll go through them and I'll put an X on the photos that I want to delete. So that would be the photos that are blurry or out of focus that I can't do anything with. And if there's photos that I really like, I'll give them a 3-star. And then I'll start editing those photos that I've given 3 stars to. And normally on a dive, to be honest with you, it's probably between 10 and 20 photos that I actually land up editing. And then once I've done that, I'll export my photos out of Lightroom onto OneDrive with my watermark on. And then I'll upload them into social media when I want to. And then what I do every month is I calibrate my monitors using my Data Color Spider, the X2 Elite. And what I've done here is I've just shown you what happens if you don't calibrate your screen. So the photo at the top is before I calibrated it, and the photo at the bottom is after I calibrated it. So if you don't calibrate your screen and you want to do things like print out your photos and share them on social media, your photos can often turn out the wrong color. In fact, I had a friend who printed a photo. It was a split shot of a Red Sea liveaboard and a reef below it with someone freediving underneath, and she printed it onto canvas. And when she printed it onto canvas, the sea turned out almost pink because her computer wasn't calibrated. So I realized then, when the importance of calibrating your screen is that if you're printing things out, or if, like me, you write for magazines, or you give your photos for books and things like that, it's really, really important to make sure that what you're seeing on your screen and what you're printing out is going to be exactly the same. So basically, the struggles that we all face underwater is we have a heavy camera. So what we need to do to make sure that our cameras aren't too heavy, we add float arms, and I use Sticks jumbo floats. I have 3 on my 8-inch floater, on my 8-inch strobe arm, and then another 2 on my 5-inch strobe arm, and I have the same on the other side. So that gives me enough flotation with my aluminium housing. And also the problems focusing, like I mentioned before, if your camera struggles to focus, then what we do is we use a focus light. That helps your camera focus much more quickly. And then if your colors are off, I always recommend, if you're using a strobe, make sure that your camera's white balance is auto white balance, and that will always make sure that your colors are correct. So use auto white balance with strobes. And of course, there's a problem with the backscatter, so we need to make sure that we position our strobes in the right way. And we need light. We need to have light underwater to bring back all those beautiful colors of what we see. And yep, there's gear failure. We just need to make sure we do our test shots, that we don't leave our lens caps on, that we've charged all our batteries. And then we do get inconsistent results, because sometimes, when you're starting out in underwater photography, you don't always know what are the right settings. So you're trying one thing and it works one day, and you try something else and it doesn't work the next. So I think what's really important is to know what settings work best with your camera for the type of photos that you want to make, so that your results can become more consistent. And then why underwater photography matters. Photography is a fantastic medium through which to create an awareness of the beauty and plight of our oceans. Images can stir many emotions, and we, as underwater photographers, have the opportunity to tell visual stories about our underwater world and to encourage its protection and preservation. That is, for me, the most important thing about underwater photography. And yes, you can do this too. So if there's any of you out there who are thinking about starting underwater photography, you can do it. And all you need is a basic setup. You can get yourself an Olympus or OMTG or a compact camera with a housing. It doesn't need to be an expensive aluminium one. There are some really good polycarbonate cameras, housings on the market that you can start off with, and one strobe. And with that, you can go out and you can capture beautiful images of what you see underwater. But before you do that, you need to learn to scuba dive. And also, before you take your camera under the water, make sure that your buoyancy is sorted. It's really important, in order to protect the marine environment, yourself and your camera, that you have good buoyancy before you even start taking photos. And then when you've got your scuba certification, you've got your camera, do a course, join a dive trip, dive with other photographers so that you can swim more slowly and you don't have to rush trying to keep up with other divers who swim a lot faster than underwater photographers. So if you can find another underwater photographer to dive with, it really helps. And I can help you too. I teach underwater photography on one-on-one basis. So I help to solve any problems that you might have with your underwater photos. Maybe you're taking pictures and you're doing something wrong and you know that you can do something to improve your photography. I can do one-on-one coaching with you, look at your photos, and I'm normally pretty good at highlighting and spotting what you're doing wrong. It's much easier for someone else to look at your photos and to tell you where you can fix them than you often. It's often quite difficult for you to figure that out yourself. So I'm here to help you with that and help you with your gear and level up your skill set. And then, of course, I offer dive trips and workshops. I've just come back from Lembe, where I taught 2 back-to-back macro underwater photography workshops. And next year I'm going back to Lembe again, as well as beautiful Banker Island for some macro and wide angle underwater photography. So I've just started taking bookings for that. And then I created the world's only online course for TG cameras. And it's a video course that takes you step by step through your camera, how to use it, the settings to use for whether you've just got your camera's flash or a video light or focus light or a strobe, takes you through how to set up your camera for macro and wider angle, and gives you lots of tips and tricks and hints on how to compose your photos. So I'm here for you. All you need to do is drop me an email, or you can visit my website, katejonker.com/learn, to find out more about the courses that I offer and how I can help you. I'd really love to. I'm passionate about helping people learn underwater photography and improve your pictures. Yeah, and I've got a YouTube channel, Kate Jonker. My web is katejonker.com. On Facebook, I'm Kate A. Jonker. On Instagram, I'm Kate Jonker Photography. And my email, if you want to email me, I'm kate@katejonker.com. And if you don't follow me on Instagram, I post tips and tricks and helpful information to help you improve your underwater photography. So follow along. Love to see you there. And I want to say to Data Color, thank you so much for organizing this and for having me. And thanks to all of you for joining me for this webinar.
I'm just going to say thank you to you, Kate. That was a really very exciting and brilliant presentation. This is also what I see here in the feedback of our audience. And I think,
thank you.
Yeah, I will end it here, and then yeah, let's wait. Next week you will see the link. And Kate, we stay in touch. Definitely, we'll really enjoyed this presentation. Hopefully,
thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, and thanks everyone for listening. I look forward to seeing all your questions. Hope I can answer them for you.
Okay, good. Okay, I will end for everybody. Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.